Hello, this is co-producer Jim here. A problem with being a fan of any long-running franchise is the inevitable losses of beloved elderly contributors. Barely a week goes by without hearing of the passing of someone whose name can take us back to childhood, thanks to a song or a performance that stayed with us well into adulthood. For Doctor Who fans, David Graham shared a special position, along with Peter Hawkins, as the original voice of the Daleks.
We know that owls are able to live on the surface and that they must have found immunity. Perhaps it is a drug. Is it failing them now? Why are these four showing signs of radiation sickness?
David would also appear on screen in two memorably tragic roles as Charlie the Barman in The Gunfighters and as Professor Kerensky in City of Death.
What are you talking about?
Well, you're tinkering with time. That's always a bad idea unless you know what you're doing.
I know what I'm doing. I am the foremost authority on temporal theory in the whole world.
The whole world?
Yes.
Well, that's a very small place when you consider the size of the universe.
But who can?
Oh, some can, and if you can't, you shouldn't tinker with time.
But you saw it work. The greatest achievement of the human race. A cellular accelerator. You saw it. An egg developed into a chicken in 30 seconds. With a large one, I can turn a calf into a cow in even less time. It will be the end of famine in the world.
David Graham was familiar to audiences, even if they didn't actually know his name, thanks to the huge variety of characters he voiced for Gerry Anderson's puppet serials. The magical western Four Feather Falls, Supercar, Fireball XL5, The Nautical Adventures of Stingray. In 1965, he showed off his versatility with the recurring roles of Gordon Tracy, Brains, Kyrano and Parker in Gerry Anderson's Thunderbirds, as well as filling in for multiple guest characters.
Put the jewels back, Parker.
Sure. Do I have to, milady? I've never had my hands on so much loot in the whole of my life.
Parker?
Oh, very well, milady.
With his distinctive speech patterns and unflappable bravery, Parker became David's most famous creation. The character even enjoyed a minor pop hit in the 1990s.
Not so now. Not so now.
Watch your eardrums. She's about to lift off.
Parker was a cultural icon bigger even than the show that spawned him. Listen out for a very brief tribute to him in Wild Blue Yonder, as David Tennant's Doctor says, "Your car, milady," in Parker's very imitable style. Now, I have to admit here that younger viewers might disagree with all of this, as in recent years he's gained notoriety as Grandpa in the internationally adored children's animated series Peppa Pig.
Peppa! George! Is this my birthday card? It's lovely. I think I'm a bit too old for a real party, Peppa.
David's final contribution to Doctor Who was some additional voice work helping to bridge the edits on the new colorized version of the first Dalek serial, which aired to mark the 60th anniversary of Doctor Who in 2023. David Graham created a body of work that will continue to thrill and inspire children of all ages, as the characters he created will live on with us for generations.
Well done, Parker.
Thank you, madam. Home, milady?
Home, Parker.
Direction point! Direction point!
A Doctor Who podcast network.
Well, hi everybody, welcome back to Doctor Who Literature. My name is Jason. We're a member of the Direction Point podcast network. I am out of town this weekend and next weekend, so please enjoy this pre-recorded episode. We are talking about the first book in the Trial of a Time Lord cycle, the novelization of The Mysterious Planet, except that it's the second Trial of a Time Lord novelization published, after the publication of Terror of the Vervoids, the third story in the Trial of a Time Lord cycle, a couple of weeks ago in the life of this podcast, and a couple of months ago in real time if you're following along in 1988. The two other Trial of a Time Lord books will also come out of order and published several months apart, and will come up on this podcast in turn in the most convoluted Doctor Who literature mini-season of all time. My guest is the great Professor Stacey Smith ? One of the most frequent repeat guests on this show, and one of the most welcome. Stacey and I will have a very good time talking about Mysterious Planet, even though we are coming at it from very different directions. But before that, I want to turn the floor back over to my co-producer, Jim Sangster. In last week's episode, The Time Meddler, I did sneakily throw at Jim a challenge. How many Target books have the word capacious in them? Jim writes, "Sneaky challenge, eh? Think you can send me homework on someone else's episode, eh?" Okay. Jim has done the following math. In the original Target run of 155 novelizations, covering Unearthly Child to Survival, but minus the Saywards, the Adamses, and the missing stories, Capacious appears, that's the missing season 23 stories, by the way, Capacious appears in just 27 books, which is 17.4%. That's Jim for you. Give me the percentage. I would have rounded down. Out of these, the word is used to describe a pocket or pockets in 20 out of 30 occasions, so 2 out of 3, or 66.7. I'd have rounded up. The other uses are capacious for mouth, lounge, liner, interior of a Rolls Royce, handkerchief, furry busby, cloak, carpet bag, boot of a car. Terrance uses it in 8 books. Malcolm Hulke uses it in 6. Pip and Jane Baker use it 3 times in 4 books, but never for the word pockets. They use it to describe lounge, liner, handkerchief, and furry busby. They're also one of the only 2 authors to use the word twice in 1 book. The other author, Nigel Robinson, uses it twice in Underwater Menace, describing pockets both times. The fact that it appears in no other Ian Marter book suddenly makes me, that is Jim, suspect Nigel Robinson wrote the section where it appears in Reign of Terror. The books are Abominable Snowmen, pockets, Brain of Morbius, pockets, Doomsday Weapon, pockets, Green Death, pockets, Full Circle, pockets, Highlanders, pockets, The Cybermen, aka the Moonbase, pockets, Greatest Show in the Galaxy, pockets, The War Games, pockets, Sea Devils, pockets, Dinosaur Invasion, i.e. Invasion of the Dinosaurs, pockets, Underwater Menace twice, The Time Meddler, Web of Fear, Invisible Enemy, State of Decay, Mysterious Planet, this week's book, pockets, Space War, pocket, that's Malcolm Hulke, Destiny of the Daleks, pocket, Paradise of Death, mouth, Terror of the Vervoids, twice, lounge and liner, Black Orchid, interior of a Rolls Royce, see, I would have guessed Minded Evil on that one, Mark of the Rani, handkerchief, Time in the Rani, furry busby, Reign of Terror, cloak, Talons of Wang Chiang, carpet bag, and the cave monster, boot of his car, that's got to be Dr. Quinn, and that's my mistake, not Jim's, 7 Malcolm Hulke books, 7 times we use the word capacious. Meanwhile, let's get immediately over to Stacey Smith. I promise that is not the last time you're going to hear Jim's voice in this episode, and the next time you hear it, it's going to be Jim, not just me merely reading out his text. Let's get to it.
Hello, fellow time travelers, and welcome to the Doctor Who Target Book Club podcast, the only podcast to discuss, in story order, all the Doctor Who novelizations. My name is Tony Witt, and every 2 weeks or so, I'm joined by a 2 to 3 person discussion panel, including our so-called expert who's been a Who fan since 1979. That would be me. We also get the views of intermediate, casual, and novice fans who either have never seen the show or who have never read these books until these podcasts, including
Dalton Hughes
and
Alison Fitz-Seyfried.
You can find us on iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you find good podcasts, or even ones like ours. You're listening to the Doctor Who Literature Podcast. Enjoy your travels.
All right, Stacey, you were my very first guest back in 2021, and now you're my most recent guest nearly 3 years later. Of course, you've been on the show several times. Last time we recorded face-to-face in Los Angeles for the Galaxy 4 book back in February. What have you been up to since, and how many new countries have you visited for the first time?
I think only one new country, which was South Korea, although I got within 400 meters of the North Korean border, but I couldn't get across in the underground tunnel.
That's further than most people get.
It is further than most people get. Yeah, I was in the DMZ, so that was kind of cool. I always zipping around. I travel a lot for work. Check this next time next year, because I'll be on sabbatical and I will be on the road for like the next 16 months.
I understand that you were recently in San Antonio, Texas, for reasons that surprised even yourself.
Yes, I got invited to what I heard was San Francisco, and I was like, hell yeah, before they even finished saying the word. And then it turned out to be San Antonio when I went to book it. So that was a bit of a surprise. It was the American Math Society invited me, so I was like, well, I guess I'm going to San Antonio.
Texas is basically a whole other country compared to the United States as a political / sociological entity.
Yeah, the one actually funny thing was I got gendered correctly more than I usually do. Everyone called me ma'am there. And I think the reason is, well, actually that happened last time I was in San Antonio in like 2006, pre-transition. But it's kind of like, when you look around, all the guys there look very, very masculine. It's like huge, broad-shouldered dudes with like plaid shirts. And, if you don't look like that, you must be a woman. So I was like, I'm having the greatest trans time here.
Wow. Yeah, I have not been to Texas in several years, but I definitely do not have your standard cowboy physique or gravelly voice.
Yeah.
How many books have you published since the last time that we met? I believe you've got a new Outside In on the way. I know I've already read your 10 Deadliest Diseases book. What else?
Yes, I published a book on how to write and edit your scientific article. So basically, I took all my editing skills, which I've really honed through the Doctor Who Ratings Guide and through Outside In and other, fun Doctor Who things that I do. And I basically apply them anyway in my job to academic papers. And I thought, why not pass along some of the tips? Well, it was more because I was kind of really sick of reading really bad scientific articles. And I was like, let me explain how this works. And so I basically took one of my papers, I broke it down by draft. And so every different draft, I explained what happens, how to, finesse, how to rewrite, how to plug the holes and so on. So that's a kind of like a fun academic book. I mean, it's not very academic-y because it's really about the academics of writing. And it's more how to. I did a similar kind of presentation at a couple of Doctor Who conventions on how to write nonfiction books, where I took my entry on Kill the Moon for Who Was the Doctor and explained how I wrote that and went back and forth with Graham on it and, built up in, from sort of first draft into fixing all the issues. Because for me, writing is editing, right? It's like writing a first draft is pretty easy. Anyone can do that. And now AI can do that very easily. But I think the key as we go forward is going to be editing skills. And these have been somewhat undervalued, I think, but it really makes a difference. And you can drag something up a long way if you're skilled at editing. And so I have explained, in some detail how to basically put a book together, how to put chapters together and so on. And I've done it for both Doctor Who stuff and then also for academic stuff. And the academic stuff just got published in a book called How to Write, but then we crossed out write and put in the word edit with a little above it. How to write or edit your scientific article.
Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned AI. This week's book is such an autopilot, I couldn't care less about the story job by Terrance Dicks, which is most unlike him. So I am toying with the idea of giving up my own script after chapter 7, which I do write and edit, and just have AI review the rest of the book for me and see what they come up with. I was over on Trap 1 a few months ago, and we were doing an episode about the DVD release of Celestial Toymaker, which I want to talk about in a moment. But we were talking about why Dodo as a companion does not work in that story. And it turns out because it wasn't scripted as a Dodo story. It was supposed to be Anne Chaplet, the 16th century girl, as the companion. And the idea was that she was going to be so naive that she would keep trying to give the game away to the people trying to defeat her. And when Dodo became the companion, they just left all the lines of dialogue in the script and didn't edit to accommodate the fact that Dodo's a very savvy 20th century girl. So I decided to use AI during that episode and look up the worst individual performances by companions in Doctor Who, the stupidest things companions have done. I read the list out on the program. The list that we got was so out of touch with reality. They must have been getting their ideas from rec.arts Doctor Who posts from 30 years ago. That's how ill-informed some of the ideas were. So writing for or correcting AI is going to be, I think, a large uphill climb because there's no way to prove that AI's assumptions are correct.
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely true. I mean, I look at it as a bit like, I get a lot of drafts of things from my students, and it's kind of like splashed together from bits of the internet and like, more recently AI and so on. And sometimes that's a great time savings, and sometimes you need an adult in the room, and there isn't one, I think, with AI. So it's a bit of a hodgepodge. The problem is, if you don't know it's a hodgepodge, it can look very convincing. I mean, AI is designed to look like the average, right? It's kind of like, and I think it can do some great things and it can do some really terrible things. I think the danger is if you don't know the difference. And of course, fast forward a couple of generations, everyone's using AI to produce their first draft of absolutely everything. Well, what's going to make the difference? Like, how do we stand out from the crowd? It's going to be, what do we do beyond that, right? That's just going to be the starting point. So how do we take it to the next level? And I think that's where kind of editing skills are going to kick in.
The gold standard for bad use of AI was last year in New York. There was this attorney, an experienced attorney, who was bringing a litigation against an airline and decided to have AI write his brief for him in federal court where the standards of professionalism are very high and rigidly enforced. He submitted a brief which cited 2 cases, but he didn't bother to fact-check the cases himself, which is a core requirement of any brief. There's a whole legal industry, company called Shepherds. They check every citation and tell you if the case has been overruled or overruled in part or is obsolete. It's called shepherdizing, and he didn't do any of that. And it turns out the cases that were cited as precedent in the brief were all imaginary cases invented by AI to prove his point. And the lawyer got sanctioned, and rightly so, because you can't submit not only can you not submit knowingly false work, you can't submit work that you didn't bother to fact check that is factually incorrect, because your signature stands for a lot. So at least where I make a living, AI is not even a good starting point, let alone a good starting point that you then fix and correct.
So actually, I think the problem goes further back than that, actually, because when I was writing the top 10 diseases of all time, because I'm very anal, and I decided that I would really check every citation that I had, and there were hundreds and hundreds of them. I manually checked every single one against the original paper, because it's very easy to go to Google Scholar and just grab your citations. Now, these are not fake ones, but what I noticed was, like, I would say a good 70% had errors in them. And the reason I'm so anal about this is because my own name is not rendered correctly. They dropped the question mark in Google. So I'm always like, why is everyone always citing my name incorrectly? And the answer is because they're just harvesting from Google Scholar. And so I was like, well, since that happens to me, let me check others. And so I went through and I was astonished. And mostly it was small things. It was like they had the wrong volume of the journal, or they had the wrong page number. But sometimes it was the wrong publication, and sometimes it was the wrong title, and sometimes it was, and there's no way to correct these easily. And so they just kind of get propagated through the system. And AI is sort of making this problem much bigger, but it's a problem that's been around for a very long time, that we sort of tend to trust stuff on the internet, and we know we shouldn't. We all know that we shouldn't, but we're so overwhelmed that we don't kind of get around to it sometimes, I think. And this happens even professionally, as you say, and definitely colleagues in my field have cited my paper wrong because they've left out my question mark, or they've left me off altogether, or things like that. I've had a number of papers where there's 3 authors and they only cite 2 of them, and I'm like, I was on there and I just happened to notice that because it's my own stuff, but I'm sure this is happening all the time.
Or the major U.S. presidential candidate who during a debate last week was fact-checked by the moderator for making up a completely untrue statement. And then the candidate shouted back at the moderator, "I know it's true. I saw it on television." So I guess television was AI before AI was AI. So,
and before that it was rumors around the campfire and everything. I mean, we're really credulous individuals as humans,
that is a fact. Just watching any Doctor Who DVD making of documentary where some member of the production team will just go off and tell fictitious stories to aggrandize themselves and make somebody else look bad. And then we go into the historical record. It turns out none of these stories or anecdotes are remotely true. Looking at you, Donald Tosh, among others.
Well, I think, Terrance Dicks, right? He said, canon is what I can remember.
You need to start with a good idea. It needn't be your good idea.
Yeah, that's right.
So before we talk about the bad idea that is Trial of a Time Lord, and again, I can do that because even though this is the first Trial of a Time Lord story, it is the second Trial of a Time Lord novelization in publication order. So I've already put my cards on the table. Celestial Toymaker, you and I are both big William Hartnell fans. The first time that I stayed at your house, and this was in Canada almost 30 years ago, we watched the Robert Frank Telesnap recon of the Savages, which had the script on screen. It was amazing. We were just in awe of how good it was.
I know. You and I were absolutely glued to the screen.
Our respective significant others fell asleep in the middle of part one. You and I were glued to the screen.
They were in the deepest sleep of their lives. Like, it was amazing.
The Savages is your cure for insomnia.
Yeah.
I don't think I've ever watched. I know that you and I watched The Gunfighters the last time that you were out staying in my place, which was now over a decade ago. How did that happen? We've never watched Celestial Toymaker together. Have you had a chance to see the animation?
I haven't yet. No, my life has been ridiculously busy. So I have it on DVD, but I haven't watched it.
Yeah, between your travel and your teaching and your academic conferences, and I literally had to schedule this recording around your social life, which is why we started 15 minutes behind schedule. If you're going to watch one animation, I think Celestial Toymaker is the way to go because they jettison the script and they just do their own images and they make the story four-dimensional, and it just works in a way that a more traditional animation might not necessarily work because most animations are not as good as the camera scripts they're replacing. Celestial Toymaker at least is trying to go for it, and I think you can't do that with every story, obviously, but I think it succeeds in this one instance.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen a few clips, of course, online, and I mean, my feeling on that is like the Celestial Toymaker. I think when we were, very young, fans, and it was a dream, right? It was like there's this story, and it goes into the wilds of the imagination, and it's the most incredible thing you've ever imagined. And then, the novelization kind of, I think, like gave us some of that, at least, from a kid reading perspective. But then they've part 4 started to circulate and we're like, oh, this is not what we thought it was. And then more information comes to light, and like there's a word in there that people are not happy with, and so on. And so it's probably been the biggest plummet of a story in terms of the heights to which it started, to which the depths to which it fell. And actually, my feeling is like this animation is a brilliant idea because it actually brings back this dream that we had about the Celestial Toymaker of being the most incredible imaginative story ever. And as soon as I saw like what they'd done, I was like, oh my god, I gotta see this, and this is going to be amazing. Because what else are you going to do? You can't just do it just a staged reconstruction of it. Like that's just going to be pretty dull. And I think the people who made the story would have gone for as wild a thing as they could have if they'd had the resources. So there's a way in which that's true to form.
I would also recommend, as an adjunct to that, the Terry Nation Army video on the Celestial Toymaker script. Basically, the script itself, because it has crossouts and typeovers and pages literally stapled together, it is an archaeological dig in and of itself. And you can see all the way back from the camera script to the original Brian Hales draft.
Oh, amazing.
You can see character names that have been, like Anne becomes Dodo. That's why Dodo is called Dodo, because they needed a 4-letter word to replace Anne, A-N-N-E. And also the George and Margaret characters are still present in the camera script in stage directions, even though they were taken out and cannot be seen anywhere in the story. The notion being that George and Margaret start off as genial avuncular figures who are playing with the Doctor and Dodo and Stephen, and over the course of the story get darker and darker until you realize they're enemies, which is one of the reasons why Part 4 suffers, because that's the one part that they are not in. And I think Peter Stevens is terrific as an adversary in Part 4, but he's only in the first 10 minutes. And then the rest of the story is people standing around the TARDIS console talking. What do we do? I don't know. What should we do? But that's another reason why the two actors who play the clowns / the playing cards / the sergeant and the chef, That's when they play by the same actor, because it was supposed to be one part all the way through. George parts 1, 2, and 3. Margaret's part 1, 2, and 3. So they had to edit the story as they went. So Celestial Toymaker is one of those stories that gets better when you look at the behind-the-scenes machinations.
Mm-hmm.
And when you watch that Terry Nation Army video, Toymaker goes from the greatest thing ever to the worst thing ever to almost the greatest thing ever again. It's almost, it should be required viewing along with the DVDs, that particular video talking about how the script evolves or devolves, as the case may be, once Donald Tosh starts doing his rewrites. So speaking of stories that are made better by the behind the scenes, Trial of a Time Lord, a story that is made worse by the behind the scenes. By the time this airs in September 1986, and we're talking about Mysterious Planet, by the time it airs, the man who wrote the script has already been dead for 4 months, had a tainted lunch, caught hepatitis, died, according to all the documentation that I've seen. It is a story where nobody understands what the twists and turns are. Nobody quite understands what is going on in the trial scenes. As the story progresses through Mind Warp and Ultimate Foe, it becomes very clear that when you start writing a story, you should know where the story is going to end before you start writing the beginning. Now, that doesn't happen with Trial of a Time Lord.
Well, I have a feeling that Robert Holmes did know where it was going, but this is unfortunately like having Chameleon on board. It's like, right, we've entrusted the entire thing to one man who loves messing around with dangerous boats. And
yes,
what could possibly go wrong?
What could possibly go wrong? When did you first see Mysterious Planet and or Trial of a Time Lord?
I watched it on TV in, I guess it was early 1987. It came to Australia, and for me, this was like one of the greatest things imaginable. So I was just like, I was blown away by the opening shot. I was like, wow, there's like, this exciting story. The Doctor's on trial. This is thrilling. And then I remember having this moment of thinking they said we're gonna show you, some old things, and I was like, oh, they're just gonna show repeats. And I've been watching so many Doctor Who repeats. I was like, oh, okay, they've only filmed a bit of new footage, and we're just gonna be watching, Terror of the Zygons again or something. And then I was thrilled when it wasn't. I was like, oh no, it's new Doctor Who. So for me, I was, 14 years old or something. This was amazing, right? This was really cool. I thought that actually I liked the whole of the trial. I think I remember loving Terror of the Vervoids as well. That was probably my favorite of the trial stories. Again, I hasten to add, I was like 14 years old, but for me, the trial was fantastic. I was really super into it, and I was kind of like, I feel like they do a lot of good. They really soften the character of the Sixth Doctor and Perry, and they soften their relationship as well. They're genuinely friends in the opening episode, and they've kind of got arms around each other, and they're teasing each other a little bit, but not in a mean way. And when the Doctor, Perry says is there any intelligent life? The Doctor's like, other than me, you mean? It's a warm kind of joke. It's not kind of the Eric Sayward kind of nastiness that we had in the season before. So I like this a lot, and I'm kind of like, oh yeah, they basically sort of solve the problem of the Sixth Doctor by kind of making him just mega intelligent. I mean, it's basically what Robert Holmes did in the Two Doctors, but they do this more again here, and it kind of sticks more. And so for me, basically, I'm like, yeah, this is good. The biggest thing about Mysterious Planet I remember reading later as a fan was discovering about this showing that they had in the UK, right? They had a preview of it, where they showed the whole of the first 4 episodes of Trial, and everybody who walked out of there, and they've seen it on the big screen and so on, it's a preview of Doctor Who, they walked out thinking this is the greatest story we've ever seen. And these are cynical, hard-bitten, UK fans who don't like anything. And they were like, wow, that was the best thing in the world. And then later they're like, yeah, it wasn't that great. And I think that's sort of true of many of us. And I certainly feel the same too. I was like, wow, that was amazing. But I was 14 years old. These people were in their 20s or 30s probably. So, the fact that it has a power, even if that power is temporary, tells you something, right? It was probably right for its time. I mean, Doctor Who was on trial, so they put the Doctor on trial. Yeah, that kind of sort of worked, but it's kind of a bit like having Aliens of London talk about the current UK election. So, it's great in the week that you see it. It may not hold up so much later, but it's not necessarily meant to. So I feel like some of it works-ish. And then, I mean, had Robert Holmes survived to write the last part of The Ultimate Foe, I think we might look back on The Mysterious Planet quite differently, right? And so I think that, he deliberately sets up things like the bleeping out of the sleepers information, for later on. And, wow, I can't wait to find out what that's about. And then, I still can't wait to find out what that was about.
I will be fair for once. It's my show. I'm allowed to be fair once in a while. When I first saw Mysterious Planet, it came to PBS in, I believe, September 1988. So I'm seeing it for the first time 2 years after it airs in the UK. I already had the novelization of Terror of the Vervoids at that point, so I already knew that Perry was dead, even before I saw the stories. And I probably found out that no, she wasn't actually dead, depending on when Mind Warp came out. I would have found out from the book that she was still alive. When I first saw Mysterious Planet, I was enraptured because, as you say, that first scene where the Doctor and Perry are walking through the forest arm in arm, and they clearly have gotten over their strife from season 22, or Eric Sayward has finally figured out that what interests him is of interest to absolutely nobody else in the viewing audience. They finally figured out how to write for these two characters at the exact moment in time that Nicola Bryant is about to leave the series.
Yeah.
And of course, at this point, I'd seen just about all of Doctor Who, and I read all the existing books many times over. To have a Doctor Who story where I hadn't read the novelization yet and where I didn't know how the story was going to end was a nice experience for me. So I went into those cliffhangers not knowing how the cliffhangers were going to be resolved, which after 4 years of fandom was now a rare thing for me. So the first time that I saw it, it was, as you say, the best thing ever. Now I have on my desktop, courtesy of Jim Sangster, the 2020 DWM survey, which is the last time they do a top-to-bottom survey of Doctor Who, Alpha through Omega. Don't forget Omega.
As if I could.
From stories 1 through 295, Trial of a Time Lord is ranked as one individual story, but in a footnote to the chart, and we know how much you love footnotes, they say that parts 1 through 4 of Trial of a Time Lord, what we know as the Mysterious Planet, achieved an audience ranking of 65.19. That would put it in between story 201 out of 295 and story 202 out of 295. In absolute terms, it is in between Into the Dalek and The Witchfinders. In terms of classic series stories only, it is in between The Mythmakers and Nightmare of Eden. First of all, The Mythmakers is so much more competently made than Nightmare of Eden. I don't know how those two stories wound up adjoining one another, but at any rate, that makes Mysterious Planet the 201st or 202nd best Doctor Who story out of 295 as the list existed in 2020
Well, I'm just going to say that I think Into the Dalek and The Witchfinders are great stories, right? This is actually, if you just told me that without the ranking, I'd be like, wow, that's incredible. Those are fantastic stories. So I don't really know what's going on with this ranking here.
I mean, to be fair, these are stories that scored 65% favorability rating. The best story on the list in 2020 is Caves of Androzani at 91.8%, and the worst story on the list at 252, check that, 295, is Twin Dilemma, which is 40.9%. So it's a middle of the pack story. 65 is technically a passing grade. Just to adapt the Darren Mooney questions from the 250 podcast, does Mysterious Planet belong on a list of the worst 1/3 of Doctor Who stories ever made?
Yeah, good question. I would say, yeah, it probably does. I wouldn't put it at the bottom of that third, but it might be more to the top of that bottom third, but it's you have to look for its positives, right? And you kind of have to go on a lot of faith about them. And if you step back a bit, it's got so many good things that we're almost there, right? It's actually one of the rare times that the Doctor actually saves the universe. Now he does it every other Saturday at tea time, but that wasn't really a thing in the classic series that much. It's maybe Logopolis, it happens in really big events, but I think there's a reason to think that the opening story of the Trial of a Time Lord after this 18-month hiatus is a big event. And you're like, okay, that's pretty cool. I mean, it has a lot of very classic kind of tropes that kind of don't quite get there. I mean, you've got this, series of double acts. You've got Glitz and Dibber, which are great. They work really well. You've got Hunkle and Tamdra, whatever they are, handbag and so on, what the Doctor calls them.
Humbug
they
and
all work
handbag,
well.
yes.
Yeah. You got this sort of the kind of like Robert Holmes goes back to his like sort of therapist speak, where he's got Glitz and Dibber kind of like Glitz is analyzing Dibber and stuff like that. The same thing that Holmes did in the Rebus operation with Romana. That has the potential to be comedy gold. And actually, Jason, I remember you on Records Doctor Who doing a Statler and Waldorf kind of version with Glitz and Dibber dialogue, and it was hilarious, and nobody knew what it was, and everyone's like, "This is really funny. What is that?" And you're like, "It's from the Mysterious Planet." We're like, "Oh." But this is good. This dialogue is good, and you made it really funny. And that's like one of the overriding memories I have about Mysterious Planet is your joke there. And you've got this sort of like build-up revolution like in the Sunmakers, but the problem is all of these things are just missing a little bit extra, right? It's just not quite there. And one might say, well, maybe it needs another polish or something, but actually reading this novelization made me realize what the missing piece was, and the problem really is the trial. All right, if you didn't have the trial scenes, you would have just a little bit more room to flesh out the script, and Holmes would have done that so brilliantly because that's what he did, right? He layered things in with like little touches that just add kind of depth to the world that we're seeing and so forth. And I think when you've got to cut out sort of 15 odd minutes from the story to fit in your trial scenes, you're going to lose that stuff because it's not essential to the plot. And that destroys the story. And I actually think that, as much as I love the trial format as an idea, it kind of doesn't work with showing an actual story. Like it's sort of like the two are trying to be two separate things and they're kind of clashing and it's not quite working for either one. But reading this novelization, as sort of, I mean, you're right that it's sort of humdrum, but it's like, it made me kind of love the Mysterious Planet again because I was like, oh, I see what they were trying to do. And it's actually closer than we think.
I have, and now that I have reached a certain age, now that I'm at the half-century mark, my memory is not what it used to be, but I have no recollection of this rec.arts Doctor Who post at all. And I can remember a lot of what I put on rec.arts, and that's to my shame because most of it was sophomoric and not very interesting. But I have no recollection of doing this at all. I'm trying to find this now, but the Usenet search tool is not as good as it used to be, much like my memory. I can't find this. Wow. It sounds great. I'm sure I was very funny.
You've forgotten better jokes than some people will ever make.
I mean, for me, this is Robert Holmes on autopilot. It's him doing a greatest hits mashup of many stories that he's written over the previous 17 years. There is elements of the Crotons. There is what appears to be a callback to the Ark in space. If you take the Fireball / Ravalox incident as the incident that caused Nerva Beacon to be repurposed into an Ark, ready to outsit eternity, if you assume it's the same timeline because it's the same author. It is Robert Holmes repeating himself, plus Time Lord intrigue he has done before. I would have thought that novelizing a Robert Holmes script would have been one of the favorite things for Terrance Dicks to do. I would have been expecting a lot more of this novelization. I think Terrance, and we've all now seen his writing room on the Blu-ray with Frank Skinner. We've all seen the typewriter that he used. We can imagine him sitting there in that library upstairs in his home, going through the script, hoping that it was going to be great, and quickly realizing that this is Robert Holmes on autopilot, and a lot of it doesn't add up. So the novelization, I have spent the last 3 years on this podcast defending Terrance Dicks against the accusation that his stories are quote-unquote mere script to page transcripts without adding anything. Usually he adds a lot more than you'd think in terms of sarcastic commentary or mythological world building or the perfect 10-word description of a minor character that you can never top if you were to try to do it for 3 pages. This is a story where I think his talents fail him, and I'll go into more detail in the audio essay after the break. For me, this is not Terrance Dicks' finest work. There's just not too much that he is able to do with the story. There isn't too much that he adds to it. There's some very funny lines, of course, here and there because that is Terrance Dicks, but I don't think he sticks the landing. How did the book strike you?
So I think better than you, actually, and partly that's because I haven't been reading a novelization every month for the last 3 years. I really enjoyed it, actually. I think you're right that it probably is more transcripty than not. I will say the first chapter where he sets the scene for the trial, that is really rich. Like, he spends a long time on like just describing the doctor, and like he really goes into some detail about how he looks and the coat and the space station and everything. In many ways, it follows the beats of the story. You start with this incredible opening, and then it kind of sort of becomes a very ordinary story. But it's like I love that first chapter so much. I love the way he describes the doctor with like sensual lips, and I was like, oh, I had not really thought of Colin Baker that way particularly, but he's very sensual lips apparently, and he gives this very long, loving description of what he's wearing, and then he describes it as quietly tasteful, and you think, Terrance, bless you, you're trying so hard to make this work. He's like, I got nothing. I cannot make the Sixth Doctor's coat anything. I'll just call it tasteful and be done with it. And so that was quite amusing. I think he he gives the unit years as like 5 years, which I remember at the time being like, wait, but that was only 3 years on TV. And so I was like, oh, was the Doctor exiled for longer than we thought? That was quite just a little moment of being like, oh, that's a decent amount of time, actually, 5 years. It was my first moment of thinking there might be stories outside what we'd seen on TV, and being like, right, okay, this is, there's more here, because I was very familiar with the unit stuff, because they were on repeats all the time on Australian television, and so I was just like, wait, there's many more years here, and so that was kind of cool. This time around, I did notice that Terrance describes it as hard labor of being the unit scientific advisor, and I was like, is that really hard labor? Like, you're not really like down in a pit like swinging an axe, but you're advising the brigadier and sipping like wine and eating cheese, but apparently that's hard labor from the Doctor's point of view. So that was quite amusing.
We are now going to activate the fact machine. I can only use it once per episode, and let's see if it can find my post from rec.arts Doctor Who from 30 years ago.
Do you know what my social worker told me? No, what did your social worker tell you? That I'm a maladjusted sociopath. That sounds like an insult to me. That's why I killed him.
It lives on in my memory.
So, Terrance Dicks, again, is able to spin a great turn of phrase in his sleep. It is what he does. He always finds the right word at the right time for the right character. He does it less in this book than he does in many of his other books, even the super short ones. And again, I'll go into all that on the audio essay. I think for me it is a disappointment. You have Doctor Who off the air for 18 months. You have it coming off a very controversial season 22, where I am hard-pressed to name a favorite story. If you're going to do a single 14-episode season with the Time Lords as the bad guys, and you're going to spin new revelations about the Doctor's background, and you're going to introduce a new antagonist who has an intimate connection to the Doctor himself, and you're going to have the Master. And by the way, introducing a future companion is a brilliant idea. And the fact that Mel is still with us in the 2024 season of Doctor Who shows how good of an idea it was to put Bonnie Langford on this show. All the elements are there for one of Doctor Who's all-time great moments. You raise a very fair point. If Robert Holmes does not die in the middle of production, maybe this winds up being a much better story. But then once he's gone, Eric Sayward wanted to use his idea about ending the season on a cliffhanger. And we do have available the Eric Sayward script for episode 14 on the Blu-ray. It is not dramatically satisfying. I'm going to utter a particular combination of words that may never have been uttered in this sequence before. Pip and Jane's episode 14 script is better than the Robert Holmes inspired Eric Sayward written script for part 14 of Trial of a Time Lord. We'll talk more about that when I talk about The Ultimate Foe with another guest on the show in several more weeks. But maybe you're right. If Ultimate Foe succeeds, maybe it lifts Mysterious Planet with it. But even though Glitz and Dibber are a very good double act, and then every time we see Glitz again, Dibber is not with him, I just think that this story is less than the sum of its parts because there's so much going on screen. You have Balazar. He lives in this underground society. He is the keeper of the books. You have Murdine, who's the only member of the society who's able to speak to the immortal robot god. Murdine is played by the guy from City of Death. So you're taking one of the best guest performers in Doctor Who and giving him a rather bland two-dimensional role.
And you have putting him the skull cap, yeah.
Yes. Plus his scowl. He definitely needs to be wearing that Tintin trench coat for sure. Mm-hmm. And then you have the Immortal, and then you have the Immortal is running a Croton's confidence game where he's taking two people, the smartest kids out of society every year, and they are just very camp, and they're just more irritating than amusing the way that they are portrayed. And then you have Joan Sims playing Boudica, and then you have the Blacklight Ariel, and then you have Glitz and Dibber, and then you have the Time Lords, and then you have the Service Robot, and then you have the Valiant. There is 17 different stories in one here. That arguably works for a story like The Flux, where the Halloween Apocalypse has, I think, 25 different named characters in 55 minutes, because that is setting up a season-long story arc, and at least you know that they have an ending, and all the stuff is going to be wrapped up. Well, not fully in flux, but at least it's wrapped up a little more satisfactorily than in a Trial of a Time Lord. I think there's just a lot going on. Brave words indeed. There's a lot going on in Mysterious Planet that is then quickly abandoned for parts 5 through 8 and parts 9 through 12 and is not revisited until parts 13 and 14. And even then, not fully revisited because Robert Holmes didn't get to write it. It just doesn't work for me. I mean, I try to be positive on this show. There are stories that I certainly dislike a lot more than Mysterious Planet or Trial of a Time Lord in general. I think its placement at the top of the bottom tier is perfectly valid placement. Maybe 10 points higher, maybe 20 points higher, or 20 places higher, I should say. But I think it's got a fair place in 2020. I certainly don't think it's that close to Mythmakers, and I don't think it's that close to Nightmare of Eden going in the other direction, but it's a fair placement. This could have been so much more, and just the way the production season went, it just didn't have a chance to be all that it could be.
Yeah, I mean, I think your summary at the beginning there of like it's less than the sum of its parts is very apt for a Mysterious Planet. Like it just needed another draft really, and or it needed no trial scenes, or it needed like just something else. I don't think that the sheer number of plot threads really held it back for me this time, because I was noticing that too as I was reading it, and I was like, oh wow, there's a lot going on here. Right? You have sort of like, I mean, Holmes is really trying to draw this what would a fireball that destroys the Earth actually look like? And I think like, most other things that you see, like, oh yeah, you're going to have the band of people living as savages upstairs, you're going to have that for sure. And then you might also have like an underground thing, but you don't also have like, the intergalactic con man coming to visit. Right. You don't also have like the Doctor and Perry. You don't also have like the multiple robots, and, and they're worshipping or they're afraid of the wrong one. Like they think the service robot is the Immortal, and then they discover there's an even bigger robot behind the robot. Like it's really trying. It's really, really, really wants to get there, and it just doesn't quite make it. But I feel like points for effort, because it's doing a lot that I think lesser stories would settle for only half of this, and probably they'd pull them off better. But some points for effort here.
Robert Holmes also usually ends his stories in very, very clever ways. The Croton ends because the Doctor filibusters the Crotons until they melt. That works pretty well. Spearhead from Space, the ending is arguably the weakest thing about it, but Caves of Androzani has a brilliant ending. Two Doctors has a lot going on as well, and it's very, very violent. But the ending of Two Doctors works pretty well, and there's also Time Lord mythology in that story. This story is resolved by the unleashing of a torrent of tapioca pudding. Why?
That's easy. So they can make that joke about dinners on you. I mean, well, I think actually, like for me, I found that the real ending in some ways is the con man conning a robot, and you're like kind of like, oh yeah, that's a great tactic, right? Like this robot is completely susceptible to glitz, just like spinning the worst story about, oh yeah, we got so much black light on the ship we can hardly see, and he's like, right. Okay, let's go with it, and you're kind of like, that's actually really funny because like everyone else is trying to kind of reason with the robot, including the doctor, and they can't do it because the robot is just this obstinate pre-programmed thing, and it's the guy who just lies to the robot that actually works. And you're like, that's very Holmesian. I really like that. And so he's like, yeah, let's go to my ship and I'll take care of it.
That is a good point. And Glitz obviously has a good reputation in fandom because he was still mentioned in the most recent season of Doctor Who with Mel talking about what happened to him. So obviously, Glitz gets his version of a happy ending in the Doctor Who universe. So we've talked about Trial of a Time Lord. Talking a little bit more about Colin Baker. At this point, Colin Baker has probably produced more Doctor Who than anybody because of all the work that he's done for Big Finish on top of his TV output. Have you been keeping up with his Big Finish work, and where do you stand on Colin Baker as one of the best doctors of all time versus one of the worst?
Well, so I haven't been keeping up with the Big Finish really because I'm not really an audio person. I've listened to them occasionally for some review purposes, but also, you know, I like my money where it is. Thank you. So, but I would say so. I have always been a big fan of Colin Baker as the TV Doctor. Like, I actually think that, like, so there was a really cool idea they had, which was like, what if the Doctor becomes unlikable? And you're kind of like, okay, let's pull this off. Let's get the greatest writers. Never mind. Okay, let's just get some writers to write the Doctor as an unlikable person. And they do this really terrible job, right? But what they do is they basically show you why this is a terrible idea. And the new series flirts with this idea, but they don't cross the line because of Colin Baker, right? Like, the new series knows very well that you cannot make the War Doctor this evil bastard. Like, right. You just can't, because we've done that before and it really failed. Colin Baker's Doctor is the experiment that failed, but I love it. I'm like, wow, this is so fascinating. And I think it really shows you why you don't want to do it, but also he's this like Byron-esque kind of mad, bad, and dangerous to know kind of a person. It's a wonder that anyone stays with him. It's a wonder he gets anything done. He can't charm the villains or anything like that the way that Tom Baker would or something like that. And yet he's kind of this kind of pig-headed kind of like, I'm just going, to push through. Just basically, it's all there in the costume. Right? It's like, and this is such a fascinating kind of period of Doctor Who that I really like it, and I wish they hadn't kind of defanged him for a Big Finish, because I understand why they did. I understand that, yes, also Colin Baker himself did not want to play this kind of, bastard Doctor like for the rest of his career. And so, yes, they made him into much more likable and so on. And yeah, sure, that's all fine. But I really think there's something to be said for the Doctor that we got. Especially because he wasn't the end of the Doctors, right? So, then you move to Sylvester McCoy, who's much more likable and everything, and, kind of the universe resets, and they don't really ever go back to that, and they probably shouldn't either. But, wow, for a while, it was a wild ride, and I kind of really love that.
Jim Sangster had a theory when he was on this show a couple of weeks ago talking about Terror of the Vervoids. He asked me, when do you think Trial of a Time Lord is set relative to the Doctor's own timeline? Because Terrance Dicks revisits the end of Trial of a Time Lord several times in his 1990s novels, most notably The Eight Doctors, and I believe at the end of Blood Harvest as well, although I have not gotten to the end of that in a while. He has this whole redemption arc for Barusa, but he also revisits the end of Trial of a Time Lord. When do you think Trial of a Time Lord takes place in the Doctor's own timeline?
I mean, he's definitely been deposed as president, so it has to be after the Five Doctors, like in sort of Time Lord continuity as well. So yeah, I mean, there's some argument that says like they always meet contemporaneously, which makes the most sense. That's the simplest kind of one. But I suppose there is another one which says it happens in the far future, in some sense. I mean, I guess contemporaneously gets complicated when you include the Valeyard, because is it contemporaneous with the Valeyard's timeline? Is it contemporaneous with the Sixth Doctor's timeline? Hard to say. All right, and so if it is contemporaneous with the Valeyard, that could put it very, very far in the future. But then we run into the Time War at some point, so kind of like, we just sort of hand wave that away, or maybe it's like the very far future, and like Time Lords are back. I mean, like the whole Valeyard thing is almost deliberately impossible to reconcile. And I think these days it's impossible to reconcile in a very different way that it was impossible to reconcile back when it was the classic series times. And yet it still defies all analysis. You just cannot pin this down, because like who is the Valiant and how does he get there is just going to destroy so many fan brains by trying to think it through, and is never going to match. It's kind of the unit dating of like the Sixth Doctor's era. Like you just cannot get a coherent answer, and the argument is also you don't really need to.
Or it's Axonite, which also defies analysis. Jim's theory is that this takes place in the 13th Doctor's timeline, and not Matt Smith, who we now know was the Doctor's 13th incarnation, even though he called himself number 11. And it's not Jodie Whittaker, who we think of as 13, even though it turns out that she is the third Doctor in the new regenerative cycle that is given to Matt Smith at the end of the 2013 season. His theory is that this takes place in the original 13th Doctor's timeline, and that the Doctor, the Sixth Doctor, is far into his own future. And that is why he is able to see Terror of the Vervoids in the Matrix. It hasn't happened for him, but it has happened 7 regenerations in the future. And that's why the Valiant is there. The Valiant is in his own native timeline. And in all this time, the Time Lords have gotten terribly corrupt. And that's why the story plays out the way it does. And Jim's theory is also that the Inquisitor is in it up to the frilly sleeves of her elaborate gown, because she has helped plot out this whole thing, and she is not as innocent as she appears to be. The story, of course, lets her off the hook in episode 14 under the hands of Pip and Jane Baker, but the way Jim sees it, she's as much as antagonist as the Valiant is. That is a reading of the story that almost rescues Trial of a Time Lord for me, but of course we don't get any textual confirmation of this on screen, so for the longest time, up until 2 weeks ago, I had Trial of a Time Lord taking place in the Sixth Doctor's own time. And that's the way that Terrance Dicks had it as well in his various books. For me, Jim's reading is a better way. Unfortunately, it's not the official canon, but it is now, from here on out, my headcanon.
Well, I mean, I think if you count the 13th Doctor in the original one and you include all the Timeless Child ones, then, I don't know, it'd probably the Sixth Doctor is the 13th Doctor. I don't remember how many there are, but, or it could be in the far past. I mean, the thing is, you cannot nail this down properly, I think. So, but that's the joy of Doctor Who fandom, right? We can argue about this endlessly.
And so we shall. But for now, it is time for us to play a game. And I've had played many different games with you over the years on this podcast. But we are going to go back to the beginning. And we are going to play a game of 20 questions. You are going to guess which story I am through a cunning procession of 20 yes or no questions. I want to see how well you do, given that we have not played this game in a while. And the randomizer.net, a production of Fly Through Entirety, has picked a story for me. You have to guess which story it is. What is your first question?
Is it a classic series story?
Yes, it is a classic series story. You are 1 for 1. I believe the record is 5. So if you get it in 4, you are the all-time winner, and you will earn the people's ovation and fame forever.
All right. Is it black and white?
You're asking if it's a monochrome story. No, it is not a monochrome story made between 1963 and 1969. There was one classic series story that began in monochrome, but only for about 30 seconds. That is not ruled out. But the seasons 1 through 6 are indeed ruled out. It is not a black and white story produced in black and white and transmitted entirely in black and white.
Is it a 1970s story?
You're going for the decade in which we were born, possibly the greatest decade of all time. And the answer is yes. Like us, this story dates back to the 1970s.
Okay, well, I don't think I'm going to break the record here, but
you could take one wild guess. You could name one story out of the 10 years, and if you get it, you are the champion for all time. Or you could play the long game like Simon Pegg and see if you can work it out the long way.
We'll probably work it out the long way, but let me spin the wheel on a random story. Is it the Robots of Death?
Ooh, good guess. Had you been right, you would have been the all-time champion of 20 questions. Unfortunately, you're not. You're a mere dilettante. It is not the Robots of Death.
Okay.
My apologies to friend of the show, Philip Hinchcliffe.
Well, speaking of, is it a Philip Hinchcliffe story?
No, it is not a Philip Hinchcliffe story.
Hmm.
Which actually narrows it down for you in terms of who the producer is. That actually takes a good chunk of Doctor Who off the table.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it does. Is it a John Pertwee story?
Yes, it is a John Pertwee story. So now that's your 6th question. You've got 14 to go. You might get it in 7 if you're lucky. You might get it in under 10. You're off to a very good start.
All right. Is Joe the companion?
Is Joe the companion? Everyone always goes for Joe as the 3rd Doctor's uber companion because she is. And yes, it is a Joe story.
Right.
Now you have 15 choices. You have 15 choices and 13 questions remaining.
All right.
You're going to have to narrow it down a little bit further.
Yeah, I know. This is going to be great. Let's do this. All right. Is it in season 9?
Is it in season 9? No, it is not a story in season 9, which begins with Day of the Daleks and ends with the Time Monster. I am excluding from that Carnival of Monsters, by the way, which was made as part of season 9, but was held back and aired in season 10. So that's still on the table, but it is not a season 9 story.
Right. Is the Master in it?
So at this point, going into question 9, after 8 questions, you have 10 stories left and 12 questions. So you're guaranteed to win. You're trying to narrow it down further with the Master. The Master was in 2 stories in season 9, and of course those are out. It is a Master story, so you have 6 choices left and 11 questions remaining.
All right.
And your last 4 questions are all yeses, so you're on a very good hot streak.
Does it primarily take place on Earth?
Yes, it does primarily take place on Earth.
Right. Sweet.
That's 5 yeses in a row, which may or may not be a 20 questions record, but you've ruled out Frontier in Space. You've ruled out Colony in Space. I think we're down to 4 stories that it could be, and you have 10 questions remaining.
Yeah. I think I got this. I'm feeling very confident. I'm trying to think of a question that cuts these in half. But is the novelization by Terrance Dicks?
Ah, very clever. You're trying to rule out some of those stories. We know that Terrance wrote the novelization for Terror of the Autons, for example. We know he wrote the novelization for The Mind of Evil. And we actually are on a Terrance Dicks episode right now. And sadly, no, it is not a Terrance Dicks novelization.
All right. Is it The Demons?
Yes, it is The Demons. You got it on question 12.
Now, please, as I was telling you, the whole world can be ours. I only need 2 things: your submission and your obedience to my will.
Because I had the next question I was going to ask was my favorite yet. I was like, was it directed by a man with the word Barry in his name?
Well, you are a winner at 20 questions. 12, getting it in 12 does not make you one of our best players ever, but it makes you far, far ahead of Bill Evenson.
Well, that's all that really counts for me.
So, Stacey, you have been on some other podcasts lately, not necessarily Doctor Who related. Tell us where else we can hear you.
I was just on the Society for Mathematical Biology podcast.
Oh, one of my favorites.
Yes, season 2. They basically launched season 2 with me. They had a sort of a live one at the conference, but it's very fascinating how similar academic conferences are to Doctor Who conventions and stuff. And they had their podcasters wandering around. But I did a whole recorded episode, and again, I was the first live podcaster at the conference. So, continuing a bold tradition here. I'm a sort of semi-regular guest on lots of different podcasts. I was on Flight Through Entirety doing The Girl Who Died. I'm on Reality Bomb occasionally. I'm around. I'm on your one more than anyone, I think, these days.
So the Verity podcast does a recurring panel in defense of at different conventions, and I volunteer to play 1 year and 1 year only. and you have 1 minute to defend some indefensible part of Doctor Who as submitted by the audience. I was given a cue from The Woman Who Lived, and I didn't remember the story well enough to understand the cue, and I completely failed because I was not able to identify even what story I was talking about, so I picked the wrong thing entirely. Girl Who Died is the story that precedes that. It's Maisie Williams' first appearance on the show. That is one of the really, really good ones from my recollection.
It's actually, I think, my favorite story from the new series. Like, it is so good, and I think it gets a bit lost, partly because of that sort of somewhat second part being on the average. But it's not. I mean, that season they presented a lot of things as looking like two-parters, and sometimes they were, and sometimes they weren't. And in that case, I mean, it has to be continued, and it has a very similar title in the next episode, but it's basically not really much to do with it, aside from the character, but that character's in a number of stories that season, so that's not really that relevant. But The Girl Who Died as its own story is this very kind of uber Doctor Who story. It is really like it breaks down the essence of Doctor Who, and it tells a entire perfect Doctor Who story within the first 2 minutes, and that's the scene in the TARDIS, and then it goes on to do it for the next 38 minutes, which is the scene with the Vikings, and then it completely upends the whole apple cart with the bit about the Doctor looking in the water and seeing his reflection and realizing why he chose that face. And it is incredibly powerful, and it looks a bit like it's supposed to be some sort of fan service explaining why Peter Capaldi is was in the show before, and it's really not. It's just this amazing moment of the Doctor's own weakness, and kind of he knows that he's not a strong enough Doctor, but he knows who was, and it was the 10th Doctor. And so he kind of puts in this link to remind himself to be better, and to be more compassionate. And he needs a companion who holds him to this compassion, and Clara is not the companion, but Donna was. So he basically brings her to mind when he needs to. And it's you're like, this is amazing. This is really strong stuff. It's also this battle between the classic series and the new series, where they basically have these incredible special effects through the Meyer helmets that they outwit with practical effects, and they just put a sheen over the top. And you're like, this is everything I come for. This is great storytelling with terrible props beats fancy special effects every day. I'm like, oh, I am lapping this up. This is my favorite story of all time. So clearly, I absolutely adore every moment of it.
Looking at the 2020 DWM survey, The Woman Who Lived is separated out and is placed at 274 out of 295. It is in between The Lazarus Experiment and above The Underwater Menace, which is coming up on this show very soon. And I believe The Underwater Menace is unfairly maligned and very misunderstood. Underwater Menace should be much higher than the bottom 21. Woman Who Lived is one tick above it. I was expecting The Girl Who Died to be much, much higher. However, according to the DWM 2020 survey, The Girl Who Died is number 232. That places it well below The Mysterious Planet. It is in between Planet of the Dead and The Return of Dr. Mysterio. In terms of classic series stories, were it to have been one, it is in between The Crotons and Colony in Space. Speaking of Robert Holmes.
This is outrageous.
I think that is far too low. When I made my top 60 for 60 list last year for the 60th anniversary, I considered what are my greatest 60 Doctor Who stories of all time. And I also ended up with a bubbling underlist of 99 stories that are my absolute favorites. To keep you in suspense, The Girl Who Died is not on it. It is not on the top 60, and it's not on the top 99 either. But I have to assume, if I were to rank the entire series from beginning to end, Woman Who Lived will be right down there at the bottom, partly because of my embarrassment at the convention playing in defense of. I think Girl Who Died is definitely a top half story, either the end of the good tier or the top half of the middle tier.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those stories that I think people overlook because at the time it's sort of, it looks like it's part 1 of 2 and so on. And then people haven't really probably gone back to that as much as, they have in some classic series and so on. And every time I do a podcast on it, which actually I must admit is quite a lot because I love this story so much, people, doing the podcast will watch it again in preparation for podcast and go like, wow, that's really good. I've forgotten about this one, and it's great stuff. The Flights for Entirety people, they're like, yeah, this is excellent. And I feel like I need to wave my flag a bit more about this story because it is really, really high quality. but it's sort of right in the middle of a very high quality era where like there are a lot of really good stories and things in the Capaldi era hang together really, really well. So in some sense, you're kind of like, well, it gets a little bit like smudged in the middle. Reminds me a bit of like Theatre of War as a new adventure, and you read that on its own and you're like, well, this is the most incredible book I've ever read. And then you read like every book around it and you're like, oh no, it's just average. But that's because the whole like range at that point is producing astonishing things. So that's kind of my my drum that I'm going to beat quite a lot, actually, is that the girl who died is one of the best Doctor Who stories ever made.
I think Peter Capaldi is my favorite of all the new series Doctors. And that's not being fair to Jodie Whittaker. In retrospect, when I did my pilgrimage and I watched the entirety of the new series in the 1 year run up to Power of the Doctor, Chris Chibnall, I think, is the best in terms of quality and in terms of avoiding problematic material. Chris Chibnall is the best of the new series showrunners. So Jodie Whittaker belongs in the conversation for the best Doctor of the new series. However, Peter Capaldi is, largely because he got there first, my favorite, at least first in terms of Jodie Whittaker. I will be appearing on the Dave Rennie podcast, A Kettle and Some String, in a few months, talking about another Peter Capaldi story. The classic series is still my favorite era of the show, but Peter Capaldi is my favorite of the new series. I'm always happy to talk about him, and I've not talked about him on a lot of podcasts. I tend to be invited on as a classic series guest. I'm looking forward to talking about that. It is not The Girl Who Died, but I will make sure to bring that up as an example of other great must-see Peter Capaldi stories. He always gives an incredible performance, even when the script is merely run-of-the-mill.
Yeah. I was showing one of my partners, the Capaldi era because she hadn't seen it, and so we just watched it way through. And she's like, "This is so good. This is amazing." We got to the end, and she's like, "Oh yeah, can we see the next Doctor?" I'm like, "Let's just take a small break." And she was like, "Oh, that's not so good." So yeah.
Well, Stacey, thank you as always for coming back and doing this. You are coming up on your 10th appearance on the show. You're not quite there yet, but you're one of my most frequent guests. You are going to be on this show in about another month's time, talking about another lesser remembered classic series story. I will not say which one, but I think one of the goals was to have you on to talk about every one of the classic 7 Doctors in turn. So in terms of achieving that, your first appearance was for the 3rd Doctor. That was Cave Monsters. You were here for the 4th Doctor to talk about Doctor Who and the Giant Robot, where you primarily spoke about Peter Davison. You were here for the That's right. You were here for the 4th Doctor again to talk about Ark in Space. You've talked about Enemy of the World. We recorded that live at Galley, talking about the 2nd Doctor. You talked about the 8 Doctors on this show, which covers all the first 8 Doctors at once. We did Galaxy 4 last time, which is Doctor number 1. We've done Doctor number 6 today. So, unfortunately, we've run out of Peter Davison books, so you never did do a Peter Davison story. Although we'll count the Giant Robot as your Peter Davison
Giant Robot,
episode.
come on.
I will have you on for the 7th Doctor, who's coming up soon. I won't say which story, but your next time out, you were talking about a past Doctor that is not Sylvester McCoy, and it is a Doctor you've talked about before. So, Stacey, I will see you in a few more weeks.
I cannot wait. Thanks for having me.
You know, Dibber, I'm the product of a broken home.
You have mentioned it on occasion, Mr. Glitz.
Which sort of unbalanced me. Made me selfish to the point where I cannot stand competition.
Know the feeling only too well, Mr. Glitz.
Whereas yours is a simple case of sociopathy, Dibber. My malaise is much more complex. A deep-rooted maladjustment, my psychiatrist said. Brought on by an infantile inability to come to terms with the more pertinent, concrete aspects of life.
Well, that sounds more like an insult than a diagnosis, Mr. Glitz.
You're right there, my lad. Mind you, I had just attempted to kill him.
Doctor Who, The Trial of a Time Lord, The Mysterious Planet. Interior title, Doctor Who Mysterious Planet. Written by Terrance Dicks. Televised as The Trial of a Time Lord, Parts 1 through 4. Teleplay by Robert Holmes. Televised in September 1986. Paperback release date April 21st, 1988. Target book number 127. Cover artist Tony Masero. The TARDIS has been taken out of time and the Doctor has been brought before a court of his fellow Time Lords. There, the sinister Valeyard accuses the Doctor of breaking Gallifrey's most important law and interfering in the affairs of other planets. If the Valeyard can prove him guilty, the Doctor must sacrifice his remaining regenerations. To prove his case, the Valeyard focuses on an adventure set in the Doctor's past. It is an adventure set on the planet Ravalox, a seemingly primitive world, but one which the Doctor and Peri find strangely familiar. If you shelve all your Doctor Who novelizations in story order, and I'm afraid I fall into that category, this is it. Starting with the first story, An Unearthly Child, most of your shelves will contain a near unbroken run of books adapted by Terrance Dicks, especially in the John Pertwee and Tom Baker eras. Until now. The Mysterious Planet is unique for two reasons. First, it's Terrance's only adaptation of a Sixth Doctor adventure, and second, as the rest of the Season 23 stories were novelized by the surviving authors, save Episode 13, and as all of the Seventh Doctor stories were adapted by their own TV writers, or in the case of Battlefield, by a different TV writer from the same season, Mysterious Planet is also the last Terrance Dicks novelization, again when the classic series is read through in story order. This is the way the line ends. This is the way the line ends. This is the way the line ends. Not with a bang, but a whimper. I love Terrance Dicks' writing, and I have spilled tens of thousands of words on the ratings guide, my former blog, Doctor Who Novels, that's DRWho Novels at WordPress, other media such as, but not limited to, the Trap One podcast, Reality Bomb, the Doctor Who Target Book Club podcast, explaining why I love Terrance Dicks' writing. Not to mention more than 4 episodes of this podcast, Doctor Who Literature. Unfortunately, just about everything that makes Terrance great, his wicked sense of humor, his descriptive powers, his ability to contextualize a story, are all largely absent from the Mysterious Planet. Fortunately, good things are still to come in his books that follow this one in publication order, but those good things are not for us to discuss here on this Sunday morning. This book could have been so much more. The Mysterious Planet, or as it's known more prosaically, Trial of a Time Lord 1 through 4, was also the final completed story of another Doctor Who Titan, Robert Holmes. Alas, Holmes's final completed story was not one of his best, a bit of a patchwork reassemblage of his previous stories, without a whole lot of added flavor. Holmes only wrote one half of another televised Doctor Who episode after September 1986, the trial scenes of Trial of a Time Lord, episode 13. The non-trial scenes in that episode were the result of an uncredited rewrite by Eric Sayward, and if you read the actual Holmes' pages on the Season 24 Blu-ray collection, the pages that Sayward rewrote, you will well understand why. And as for episode 14 of Trial of a Time Lord, well, we'll come to that when we reach the ultimate faux novelization in another 6 weeks or so on this podcast, and it's probably not going to be pretty. The opening of Part 1 of Trial of a Time Lord is usually described as one of the best visual effects that Doctor Who pulled off, in part attributed to the fact, or so it is said, that JNT didn't realize when the show's typical season episode count was halved from 13 by 45 to 13 by 25, that the budget was also going to be halved. But Terrance opens the novelization with a pan of space, not the motion camera pan that opens the TV episode. He instead transcribes Holmes' original description of the trial venue, which you can find on the Blu-ray collection, for example, both in the pop-up production notes and as read out by Eric Sayward in his audio commentary. Typically, when Terrance adapts a script, he's painting a word picture that improves on the TV visuals, but by 1986, the visuals had finally gotten good, and here, for just this once, those visuals are better than the prose. Terrance was best known, among other things, for his descriptions of the other Doctors in print. A young old face, vaguely bohemian clothes, a pleasant, open face. His 6th Doctor capsule summary, here is the only time he got to write one, sadly engages in some inadvertent body shaming, not that we really had a phrase for that in 1986, comments on Colin Baker's weight gain during the 18-month series hiatus. Quote, a tall, strongly built man with a slight tendency towards overweight. I do, however, like Terrance's jab at producer John Nathan Turner's ill-advised costume choice for Colin, quote, a multicolored coat that might have made Joseph himself feel a pang of envy. Once the stories begin, the Ravelock's adventure and the trial framework, Terrance mostly retreats into himself. Although I have decried many unfair characterizations of Terrance's prose over the years, and I refute that this book reads merely as a simple transcript of the camera script, Terrance, unusually, does not inject himself all that much into the proceedings. Little humor, little insight is added. In fact, Terrance even misspells Perry's first name on page 46. And at 121 pages of text, this is his shortest Target book in quite some time. Things are better inside the Doctor's head, reflecting on the Time Lord's pomposity, or on his companion Perry. Quote, the Doctor looked down and smiled, amused as always by Perry's outspoken directness. Presumably it came from her American ancestry. Hey now. Though on TV from this point onward, Perry is slightly retconned as British, alluding to London as her home in the serial. By the time RTD shoots new material for the character in 2023, her American home is located as Baltimore. No, she's not. I lived in Baltimore for 6 years, and that is not close to the local accent, hon. It's when Terrance is writing a uniquely Holmesian scenario that he comes alive, at least for a few paragraphs, page 26. Glitz hated primitive worlds. Unfortunately, the police were too well organized on the civilized ones, and a man had to take his business opportunities where he found them. Dibber, same page, has his, quote, usual lightning grasp of the obvious. Terrance can write for double acts like this in his sleep, but the part 1 cliffhanger, page 41 into 42, is lifeless. The great Colin Baker, as well as the recently deceased actor who played the Valeyard, get off some excellent line readings in the final scene, but Terrance adds nothing to the dialogue in the book. No observations, no commentary.
Oh! Why'd you stop it at the best bit? I was rather enjoying that.
I'm sure you were.
Clever, eh? That trick with the umbrella.
Most ingenious, my dear Doctor.
Oh, I always like to do the unexpected. Takes people by surprise.
Hear how the Doctor takes pride in his interference. Hear how he boasts. This is not the reaction of a responsible Time Lord.
We are all aware of that, Valeyard. What is the point you are trying to make?
These proceedings started as a mere inquiry into the Doctor's activities. I am suggesting now that it becomes a trial. And if he is found guilty, I strongly suggest the termination of his life.
And the remaining 3 episodes each get substantially fewer pages by count than the 36 pages out of 121 lavished on part 1, so you can imagine how much more cursory is the rest of the book. This is not Terrance's first short book, of course. In the very late 70s, Destiny of the Daleks, Robots of Death, Image of the Fendal, all barely topped 100 pages, but I defended each of those books when they came up in Doctor Who literature. Well, maybe not Fendal, a story that even Terrance couldn't save, but if Mysterious Planet is Bob Holmes on autopilot and dull, the book reflects that. Terrance instantly loathes Tandril and Humker, Drathro's 2 servants, rejects from the Crotons, Holmes' first Doctor Who script. He describes them on page 48 as, quote, one was called Tandril, the other Humker. Apart from that, they were pretty much identical. Drathro laments their presence in his castle, as Terrance clearly laments their presence in the book. Less coherent plot points like the service robot Terrance barely introduces, and on page 53 he starts musing about Hollywood's mid-20th century practice of serial monogamy. That makes this book much like Terrance's novelization of Arc of Infinity, a story he decided made no sense, and in which he made no effort at all to patch over or rationalize. Even the prose reference to Sacred Flame, clearly Terrance's homage to Holmes's own Brain of Morbius, which began life as a Terrance script itself, barely makes an impact on the reader and could almost be accidental. Terrance takes the Cullings to a very dark place on page 67, telling us that in order to keep Drathro's underground survival colony at 500 residents, and we've already learned that there's no need for the colony, not with life flourishing on the surface, that periodically, quote, men, women, and children, even children, were taken away and brutally killed. The spelling of Grell's name changes between pages 44 and 68. Credit to Stacey for pointing that out. And on the same latter page, Broken Tooth becomes Broken Nose. See, this is exactly the point in the text where Terrance has clearly run out of four-letter words to give and set his sights on the Wheel in Space, his next novelization after this one instead. Chapter 8 is a mere 7 pages of text and is a dizzying array of disconnected scenes. I think Stacey is right. Had Robert Holmes survived past May 1986 and been around to write Part 14, and perhaps a finale that revisited Ravolox, we might be praising this story a lot more than we did. But Terrance is clearly at this point just typing page after page and adding as little of himself as possible, which again is unusual for Terrance. On page 86, he speculates that Katrika's tribe's collection of guns comes from, quote, certain unfortunate star travelers in years gone by, a grisly little detail which suggests that Katrika's killed all those who came to try and steal the blacklight converter that she worshipped as a totem and kept their guns. A fun detail in a book short of them. Chapter 10 races by, lots of scenes ending with quips or revelations, which Terrance just lets hang there, without adding his own usually acerbic commentary. Nor does Terrance explain why the Valeyard lets the Doctor even see the Ravolox material in the first place, considering that it was the key to the Doctor unraveling the Time Lord's whole corrupt system in one of the remaining scenes from Part 13 that Holmes did write. Now, it's problematic in Doctor Who when a female character dies a violent death. The problem, whether the old series or the new, the ending of the next Doctor, is ruined for me for that reason. Katrika's death here, page 102, is violent and unnecessary, though at least Terrance, while explaining that all her hair is burnt off in death, rushes through in less than a paragraph. Eric Sayward would have gotten at least 2 pages out of that. No longer paying much attention, though, Terrance uses the word staggered twice in the same line of print on page 117, and not in a poetic way either, with carefully structured parallel sentences. That said, I do like Stacey's point about Glitz out-talking Drathro being a strong plot point for the climax in Part 4.
No, wait a minute. Why don't we just... if it's only black light you want, Drathro, we have plenty of that, don't we, Dibber?
Do we?
Yeah, on the ship, Dibber.
Oh, the black light? Yeah, we've got so much of that sometimes we can hardly see.
There is black light on your ship?
As my friend says. So what I suggest we do is you come with us and we'll fix you up, eh?
Why?
Well, I hate to see a good-looking robot like you go to waste. I'll tell you what else we can do for you. We can drop you back in the constellation of Andromeda. How about that?
It is possible.
And all the secrets, of course, you must bring them. They'll expect you to bring them.
How far from here is your ship?
Well, right outside, really. No distance at all.
I could function for a short distance.
Of course you could.
And I accept your offer.
Terrance does go the extra mile to liven this up by having the Doctor mentally follow along with Glitz's con on page 119 and accurately predict the sting at the end of the sales job, Glitz wanting the secrets that Drathro's been hiding, which we eventually learn, spoiler alert, from the remains of Part 13 and 14, are the secrets of the Time Lord Matrix. On TV, Colin Baker expertly portrays this, with an eye roll at the camera, but of course you can't hear that on the audio. Chapter 14 is titled End and Beginning, which is a hasty and uninspired version of An End and a Beginning from Terrance's far better books, including the next Terrance book after this one. Terrance repeats the Doctor's well-delivered line on TV to Balazar.
And still the lobster held on.
but with no context, such that if you've never read The Water Babies, you wouldn't know that it was a quote from one of Balazar's 3 books. Page 123 at least has the very best line of the book. Glitz reflects, quote, "A very worrying thought. Suppose it was Dibber who was the brainy one after all. We'd never get to find out." Terrance wraps the book up with half a page worth of questions on page 127, and when we conclude Trial of a Time Lord later on in this non-consecutive mini-season, we'll see exactly just how many of those questions remain unanswered. Quote, "The Doctor loved a good mystery, and there were many mysteries here. There were questions to be answered, not only those he posed to Peri on Ravolox, or Earth as it seemed to be, but questions about this precious trial, or inquiry, or whatever it was. Why was he here? And where was he, come to that? Who was the Valeyard, and why was he so passionate for the Doctor's death? What part would the enigmatic Inquisitor play? Why had certain evidence been suppressed? Perhaps his next adventure would reveal the answers. ... As with the android invasion, episode 44 of this podcast, when Terrance wraps up a book with a laundry list of plot holes, you appreciate that at long last you have reached the end of a world of hurt. Next time on Doctor Who Literature, I'd like to tell you that it gets better. I'd like to tell you that we go from the ridiculous to the sublime. I'd like to tell you that the next book is a novelization of a sober and serious and well-crafted and well-acted television story with nothing embarrassing about it at all. And I'd like to tell you that it is a dark and rich work of prose from one of the more serious and awe-inspiring authors in the Target stable. Instead, next week, join me and 2 other guests, one live, one an archival interview, as we talk about time and the Rani. Thank you for joining me on another episode of Doctor Who Literature. The executive producer is David Barsky. This episode was produced by Jim Sangster and yours truly. This week's episode was written and edited by me. Our logo was designed by Jim Sangster. Special thanks to my special guest, Stacey Smith. Jason's post from rec.arts Doctor Who, located by Stacey, is dated April 6, 1996, in a thread entitled Muppet Doctor, and was performed by our in-house Statler and Waldorf, Mr. Jim Sangster. This podcast can be found on most of your podcast apps of choice. You can find all past episodes at podcasters.spotify.com/pod/show/Doctor Who Lit. It really helps if you rate 5 stars and subscribe. You can find me on Blue Sky and YouTube at Doctor Who Novels, that's DRWho Novels, and on email at Doctor Who Literature, that's drwholiterature@gmail.com. Please drop me a line with your comments, questions, and suggestions. Thank you for listening, and whatever you do, keep turning the pages.
Direction point! Direction point!
A Doctor Who podcast network.